My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 23 years old. I live in a small apartment in downtown Seattle, working as a barista at a local coffee shop while trying to finish my degree in social work. People always say I'm quiet, maybe too quiet for my own good. But when you grow up feeling invisible in your own family, you learn to observe more than you speak. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was rushing to get ready for work. Rain was pattering against my apartment window, typical Seattle weather that matched my mood most days. My phone buzzed, and I saw my cousin Derek's name on the screen. We hadn't talked in months, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. "Sarah? Hey, it's Derek." His voice sounded strained, formal even. "I have some bad news. Grandpa Joe passed away yesterday evening." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto my unmade bed, the phone trembling in my hand. Grandpa Joe, the only person in my family who had ever made me feel like I truly mattered. The man who taught me how to tie my shoes, who listened to my childhood dreams with genuine interest, who sent me $20 bills and birthday cards, even when the rest of the family forgot my birthday entirely. "How?" I managed to whisper. "Heart attack. It was quick, Sarah. He didn't suffer." Derek paused, and I could hear voices in the background, my Aunt Linda's sharp tone cutting through the static. "The funeral is this Saturday at 2 o'clock, St. Mary's Church on Pine Street. I'll be there," I said immediately. "Good. Look, I have to go. Mom's handling the arrangements, and there's a lot to coordinate." Another pause. "Oh, and Sarah? It's going to be a big service. Grandpa had a lot of friends from his veteran groups in the neighborhood." After Derek hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment, letting the reality sink in. Grandpa Joe was gone. The man who had been my anchor in a family that often treated me like an afterthought was no longer there. I called in sick to work and spent the day crying, remembering all the moments we'd shared. Grandpa Joe had served in Vietnam, though he rarely talked about it. What I knew came in fragments, stories about friendships forged in impossible circumstances, about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear about what he'd experienced. He'd worked construction for 40 years after the war, built a good life for himself and Grandma Rose before she passed 10 years ago. But more than his accomplishments, I remembered his kindness. When I was 12 and going through my awkward phase, he was the one who took me to get my first pair of glasses when my parents were too busy with my older brother's football season. When I graduated high school, he was the only family member who asked me what I wanted to do with my life instead of telling me what I should do. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes Seattle beautiful. I put on my only black dress, a simple one I'd bought for job interviews, and took the bus to the church. St. Mary's was an old brick building with tall windows and a bell tower that cast long shadows across the parking lot. Cars filled every available space, and I could see people in dark clothing walking toward the entrance. Inside, the church was packed. I'd never seen so many people in one place for anything related to my family. The front pews were occupied by my immediate relatives, Aunt Linda and Uncle Mark, with their kids, Derek and Jessica. My parents looking uncomfortable in their rarely worn church clothes. My brother Tom with his wife and 2 young children. I slipped into a pew near the back, hoping someone might notice me and wave me forward. But as I scanned the familiar faces, I realized something that shouldn't have surprised me but still stung. No one had saved me a seat. No one was looking for me. In a church full of mourners for my grandfather, I was completely alone. The service began with Reverend Matthews speaking about Grandpa Joe's life. He talked about his military service, his dedication to his family, his involvement in the community. One by one, people went to the podium to share memories. His old Army buddy Frank spoke about their friendship spanning 50 years. Mrs. Henderson from next door talked about how Grandpa Joe always shoveled her sidewalk without being asked. A young man I didn't recognize shared how Grandpa Joe had mentored him through a veterans support group. Then came the family tributes. Derek went first, sharing a story about fishing trips and life lessons. Jessica talked about how Grandpa Joe taught her to drive. Even my parents and Uncle Mark spoke, sharing memories I'd never heard before. I waited. I kept thinking someone would remember that I might want to say something too. That maybe the granddaughter who had spent countless afternoons listening to his stories might have something to contribute. But as the service moved toward its conclusion, it became clear that I hadn't even been considered. The burial was at Forest Lawn Cemetery, about a 20-minute drive from the church. I followed the procession in my beat-up Honda Civic, staying far enough back to avoid drawing attention to myself. At the graveside, The same pattern repeated itself. Family members were given front positions while I stood behind a group of strangers, straining to hear the final prayers. As dirt was thrown onto the casket and people began to disperse, I finally approached the grave. Most of the crowd had moved toward their cars, engaged in the kind of small talk that happens after funerals. Discussions of where to meet for dinner, weekend plans, catching up with relatives seen only at weddings and funerals. I knelt beside the fresh grave, my dress getting damp from the grass. "I'm sorry I didn't get to say goodbye properly, Grandpa," I whispered. "I wish I could have told everyone how much you meant to me, how you were the only one who ever really saw me." The tears came then, hot and silent. I mourned not just for his death, but for the isolation I felt even in the middle of my own family's grief. How was it possible to feel so alone when surrounded by people who shared my last name, my history, my loss? I heard footsteps approaching and quickly wiped my eyes, expecting to see a groundskeeper waiting for me to leave. Instead, I looked up to see a man in his 70s wearing a crisp military uniform decorated with ribbons and medals. His face was weathered but kind, with the same sharp blue eyes I remembered from Grandpa Joe's old photographs. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Joe talked about you constantly. I'm Colonel William Hayes, retired. I served with your grandfather." I stood up, brushing dirt from my dress. "He talked about me?" Colonel Hayes smiled, and I could see genuine warmth in his expression. "Child, you were one of the lights of that man's life. Every time we met for coffee, he had new stories about his granddaughter, Sarah. How proud he was of you working your way through college, how you visited him more than anyone else in the family, how you actually listened when he talked." This revelation hit me like a physical force. I didn't know I knew we were close, but Joe was worried about you, the colonel continued. He could see how the family dynamics affected you, made you feel like you didn't matter. He used to say you reminded him of himself at your age, overlooked but observant, quiet but strong. We walked slowly away from the grave, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the headstones. Colonel Hayes moved with the careful precision of someone whose body bore the weight of both age and old injuries. "He left something for you," the colonel said as we reached the parking area. "Asked me to make sure you got it. Said the lawyers might not understand how important it was." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by decades of handling. "These belonged to Joe. He wanted you to have them." I took the box with trembling hands. It was heavier than I'd expected, carved from what looked like walnut, with small hinges that had been polished to a soft gleam. "What is it?" "Open it." Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, were military medals. I recognized some of them from history classes: a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, campaign medals from Vietnam. But there were also personal items: a small photograph of Grandpa Joe in uniform, looking impossibly young, a letter written in careful handwriting, and something that made my breath catch: a small silver locket that I remembered Grandma Rose wearing. "He earned every one of those medals through sacrifice and service," Colonel Hayes said quietly. "But he told me the most important thing about them wasn't what they represented about the past, but what they might mean for the future. He wanted you to have them because he believed you understood the value of service to others, even when that service goes unrecognized." I lifted the letter from the box. My name was written on the envelope in Grandpa Joe's familiar handwriting, the same careful script he'd used on all those birthday cards over the years. "He wrote that about 6 months ago," the colonel explained. "After his first heart attack, the doctors told him he needed to get his affairs in order, but Joe being Joe, he was more concerned about making sure the right things went to the right people." The parking lot was nearly empty now. I could see my family members gathered around my aunt's SUV in the distance, but no one was looking in my direction. No one had noticed that I wasn't with them, just as no one had noticed I was missing from the front pews during the service. "Why me?" I asked, still staring at the contents of the box. I'm nobody special in this family." Colonel Hayes placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Sarah, that man spent 2 tours in Vietnam, saw things that would break most people, came home to a country that treated veterans like pariahs. He worked construction for 40 years, raised a family, lost the love of his life, and kept going. You know what he told me was his greatest accomplishment?" I shook my head. "Raising a granddaughter who had the strength to be kind in a world that often isn't kind back, who chose to study social work because she wanted to help people. even though she could barely afford her own rent, who visited an old man every Sunday just because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone expected it. The weight of his words settled over me like a warm blanket. For so long, I'd felt like the forgotten one, the afterthought in family gatherings and holiday photos. But Grandpa Joe had seen something different. He'd seen someone worth believing in. "Read the letter when you're ready," Colonel Hayes said. "And Sarah, that man was proud of you every single day. Don't let anyone make you forget that." He walked away toward a vintage Buick parked under an old oak tree, leaving me standing alone with the box of medals and a heart full of emotions I couldn't quite name. In the distance, I could hear my family making plans for dinner, their voices carrying on the afternoon air. But for the first time in years, their exclusion didn't sting quite as much. I had something they didn't have: the knowledge that someone had seen my worth, had believed in my potential, had chosen me as the keeper of his most precious memories. As I walked back to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: the quiet confidence that comes from being truly valued by someone who mattered. I didn't open Grandpa Joe's letter until I got home that evening. My apartment felt different somehow, smaller and more cramped, but also more intimate. The wooden box sat on my kitchen table like a centerpiece, commanding attention even in the dim light filtering through my small windows. I made a cup of tea with shaking hands, the same chamomile blend that Grandpa Joe always served when I visited him on Sunday afternoons. His house had smelled like that tea and Old Spice cologne, with underlying notes of leather from his favorite recliner and the faint scent of wood polish from Grandma Rose's antique furniture that he'd kept exactly as she'd left it. The envelope crinkled softly as I opened it. Inside were 3 pages of his careful handwriting, written in the blue ink he preferred. Even seeing his penmanship made my eyes burn with fresh tears. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then old Colonel Hayes kept his promise, and I'm probably looking down from wherever good soldiers go when their tour of duty is over. I hope the service wasn't too formal. You know how much I hate when people make a fuss. I'm writing this letter because there are things I need you to know, things I should have said when I could still look you in the eye and watch your face as you heard them. You've always been special, Sarah, but I don't think you realize just how special. When you were little, maybe 7 or 8 years old, you came to visit me after one of those family gatherings where you'd been overlooked again. You were trying so hard not to cry, but I could see it in your eyes, that hurt that comes from feeling invisible. You asked me why some people get noticed and others don't. I told you then that the people worth knowing are often the ones who observe quietly and care deeply. I told you that being overlooked isn't the same as being worthless. I've watched you grow into exactly the kind of person I hoped you'd become. You chose a field of study that focuses on helping others, even though you could have picked something that would make you more money. You visit an old man every Sunday, even though your cousins only show up when they need something. You listen when people talk, really listen, which is rarer than you might think. These medals represent a time in my life when I learned about sacrifice and service, about standing up for what's right even when it's dangerous. But more than that, they represent the belief that some things are worth fighting for: dignity, compassion, the idea that every person has value even when the world doesn't recognize it. I'm giving them to you because I see those same qualities in you. Not the fighting part. God knows the world has enough conflict, but the service part, the standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves part. You're going to do important work in this world, Sarah, and I want you to remember that you come from a line of people who believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Don't let your family's blindness make you doubt your worth. Sometimes, the people closest to us are the least able to see who we really are. They've put you in a box labeled quiet granddaughter, and they've never bothered to look deeper. But I've seen you, really seen you, and I am so proud of who you are and who you're becoming. The locket was Grandma Rose's. She would have wanted you to have it. Inside, you'll find a picture of the two of us from our wedding day. We were young and stupid and completely in love. She used to say that love wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up, consistently and quietly, for the people who mattered. You've shown up for me in ways that meant more than you'll ever know. I hope you'll wear it sometimes and remember that you are loved, deeply and completely, exactly as you are. Not as who someone thinks you should be, but as the remarkable young woman you already are. Take care of yourself, sweetheart. Make your mark on this world. And remember, you were never invisible to me. All my love, Grandpa Joe P.S. There's a key taped to the bottom of this box. It opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. Box 247. The paperwork is all taken care of. There's something there I want you to have, but only when you're ready to understand what it means. I set the letter down with hands that were shaking so hard I could barely maintain my grip. The words blurred through my tears, but their meaning was crystal clear. He had seen me, really seen me. All those years when I felt like a ghost in my own family, Grandpa Joe had been watching, recognizing, valuing who I was. I picked up Grandma Rose's locket, feeling its familiar weight. I remembered it from my childhood, how she would absently touch it when she was thinking, how it caught the light when she laughed. Inside, just as Grandpa Joe had promised, was a tiny photograph of them on their wedding day. They looked impossibly young and radiantly happy, staring at each other with the kind of love that romance novels try to capture, but rarely achieve. The key was exactly where he said it would be, taped carefully to the bottom of the wooden box. It was small and brass, with numbers etched along the side. Whatever was in that safety deposit box, Grandpa Joe had planned this moment carefully, thought about what I would need and when I would need it. But I wasn't ready for that yet. The letter alone had overwhelmed me with its validation and love. I needed time to process the magnitude of what he'd given me, not just the medals and the locket, but the knowledge that I had been seen and valued by someone whose opinion mattered more than all the rest combined. I called in sick to work again the next day. I know it wasn't responsible, but I needed time to think, to really absorb what had happened. I spent the morning researching Grandpa Joe's medals online, learning about the battles he'd fought and the injuries he'd sustained. The Purple Heart alone told a story of sacrifice I'd never fully understood. The Bronze Star was for heroic achievement in ground combat. I found the citation online after digging through military records. Staff Sergeant Joseph Mitchell had risked his own life to pull 2 wounded soldiers to safety during an ambush in 1969. He'd taken shrapnel in his leg and back, but had refused medical evacuation until both men were stable. I had never known these details. Grandpa Joe had always been reluctant to talk about his war experiences, usually deflecting with jokes or changing the subject when family members asked. But the records painted a picture of extraordinary courage under fire, of a young man who had embodied the values he would later try to instill in his granddaughter. Around noon, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Sarah, honey, we missed you at dinner last night after the service. Aunt Linda made reservations at that Italian place downtown, and we had a nice time reminiscing about Dad." The casual way she mentioned it stung. They had made plans without thinking to include me, had spent an evening sharing memories of the man I'd been closest to, and it had only now occurred to someone to mention it. "I needed some time alone," I said carefully. Of course. Grief affects everyone differently. Listen, your father and I are heading back home this afternoon, but we wanted to see if you needed anything. Help with school or anything like that." It was a kind offer, the sort of parental gesture that should have warmed my heart, but it felt hollow after years of similar offers that never quite materialized into actual support. They meant well, but they'd never taken the time to understand what I actually needed. "I'm okay, Mom. Thanks for asking." "Good. Oh, and Sarah? Linda mentioned that Dad had some old military stuff lying around his house. If you want any of it, you should probably speak up soon. They're having an estate sale next weekend to clear everything out." My grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of military stuff?" "Oh, old uniforms, photographs, maybe some paperwork. Linda doesn't want to keep it all, and frankly, it's just taking up space. Derek thought maybe the VFW would want some of it for their museum." The casual dismissal of Grandpa Joe's service record, the reducing of his military career to stuff that was taking up space, made my stomach clench with anger. But I realized that this was exactly what he had been protecting me from. The family's inability to understand the deeper meaning of things, their tendency to treat sentiment as inconvenience. "I'd like to go through it before anything gets donated or sold," I said firmly. "Oh," my mother sounded surprised, as if she hadn't expected me to have any interest. "Well, I suppose that would be fine. You'll need to coordinate with Linda, though. She's handling all the estate arrangements." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the metal box and feeling a new kind of determination building in my chest. Grandpa Joe had trusted me with his most precious possessions because he believed I would understand their value. He had seen something in me that even I was still learning to recognize. That afternoon, I drove to his house for what I knew would be the last time. The small ranch-style home looked the same from the outside. Neat lawn, flowers that Grandpa Joe had tended every evening after work, the American flag he raised every morning and lowered every evening with military precision. But inside, the house already felt different. Aunt Linda's organizing had begun. Items were sorted into boxes labeled Keep, Donate, and Sell. I could see that most of Grandpa Joe's personal effects were headed for donation or disposal. "Oh, Sarah!" Aunt Linda looked up from a box of kitchen items, slightly flustered. "I didn't know you were coming by today. Mom mentioned that there might be some military items I could look at before you donate them." "Yes, of course. They're mostly in his den. Honestly, I don't know what to do with most of it. Derek has no interest in old war memorabilia, and Jessica certainly doesn't want it cluttering up her apartment." The den had been Grandpa Joe's sanctuary. His recliner sat in its usual position facing the window, where he could watch the birds at his feeder while reading the newspaper. His small desk was covered with papers that Linda had been sorting through. And on the walls, for the first time, I really noticed the photographs. There were dozens of them. Pictures from his army days, group shots with men whose faces showed the strain of combat, images from Veterans Day parades and VFW meetings. But scattered among them were photographs I'd never paid attention to before. Pictures of me. Me at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on his lap while he read me a story. Me at 10, proudly showing off a school project about family history that I'd built around his military service. Me at my high school graduation, standing between him and Grandma Rose, all three of us beaming. Recent photos, too. Candid shots he must have taken during my Sunday visits, pictures of me helping in his garden or washing dishes after our simple meals together. I had never realized that I was so prominently featured in his private space. While the family pictures in the living room focused primarily on my cousins and brother, the accomplished ones, the ones with clear achievements and conventional success, his personal space told a different story. Here, I was the one who mattered most. "He really loved you, you know." I turned to find Aunt Linda standing in the doorway, her expression softer than usual. "I know we haven't always... Well, your father and Linda, we've always been focused on Derek and Jessica and Tom. They're easier somehow, more outgoing, more conventional. But Dad saw something special in you. He talked about you all the time. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from that side of the family, and I found myself unexpectedly touched by her honesty. "Can I have some of these photographs?" I asked. "Take whatever you want, honey." And there's a trunk in his bedroom closet that I haven't gone through yet. It's mostly military stuff, probably more interesting to you than to me. The trunk was old and heavy, made of wood and metal with brass corners. Inside, I found a carefully preserved collection of Grandpa Joe's military life. His dress uniform, still in perfect condition. Correspondence from army friends. Maps from places I'd only seen in history books. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, another set of medals. These weren't the ones he'd left me in the wooden box. These were older, more tarnished, with different ribbons and insignias. As I examined them more closely, I realized they weren't his at all. The name engraved on one of them read, Private First Class Robert Mitchell, Grandpa Joe's older brother, who I'd been told died in Korea. There was a letter with them, written in a young soldier's hasty scrawl. "Joe, if something happens to me, make sure Mom gets these. Tell her I was thinking about home when it happened. Tell her I was proud to serve. And take care of yourself, little brother. You're going to do great things. Bobby." I sat on the floor of Grandpa Joe's bedroom, surrounded by the tangible evidence of 2 generations of military service, and finally understood the full weight of what he had given me. It wasn't just about his own sacrifice. It was about a family legacy of service, of standing up for something larger than yourself, of understanding that some things are worth the risk. He had chosen me to carry that legacy forward, not because I was a soldier like he had been, but because I had chosen a path of service in my own way. Social work might not come with medals and ribbons, but it required the same commitment to something greater than personal gain. As I carefully repacked the trunk, I made a decision. I would keep all of it, the photographs, the uniforms, the letters, the medals, not hidden away in storage, but displayed with pride. I would create a space in my own life that honored not just Grandpa Joe's memory, but the values he had tried to pass down. And I would finally accept what he had been trying to tell me all along, that being overlooked by some people didn't make me less valuable, that quiet service was as meaningful as loud achievement, and that I had been chosen, deliberately and lovingly chosen, to carry forward something important. The safety deposit box could wait. I had enough revelations for one day, but I knew that when I was ready, whatever Grandpa Joe had left there would be another piece of the puzzle, another part of the legacy he had so carefully planned for me to inherit. 3 weeks passed before I found the courage to visit the safety deposit box. I had spent that time adjusting to a new understanding of myself and my place in the family dynamic. The metal box sat on my dresser, where I could see it every morning when I woke up, a daily reminder that someone had believed in me completely. Work felt different too. When difficult customers came into the coffee shop, I found myself responding with more patience and understanding. When coworkers complained about their problems, I listened more attentively. It was as if Grandpa Joe's recognition had unlocked something in me, a confidence I'd never fully possessed before. I had also started visiting the Veterans Center downtown once a week, volunteering to help with their community outreach program. It seemed like a way to honor Grandpa Joe's memory while putting my social work skills to use. The older veterans reminded me of him, proud men and women who had served their country and then quietly built lives of dignity and purpose. Colonel Hayes met me there one evening. I was helping organize donations when I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, still wearing his precise military bearing, but with a warm smile that reminded me of our conversation at the cemetery. "Sarah, good to see you again. How are you settling in here?" "It feels right," I said honestly, "like something I should have been doing all along." "Joe would be pleased. He always said you had the heart for service work." The colonel paused, studying my face. "Have you been to the bank yet?" I shook my head. "I keep meaning to, but I'm not sure I'm ready for whatever's in there. Can I offer some advice from an old soldier?" I nodded. "Sometimes the things we're most afraid to face are the ones that will change our lives for the better. Your grandfather was a strategic man, Sarah. Everything he did had a purpose. If he wanted you to find something in that box, it's because you need to find it." That Saturday morning, I finally walked into First National Bank. The building was intimidating, all marble and brass, with the kind of formal atmosphere that made me acutely aware of my discount store clothing and student budget lifestyle. I approached the customer service desk with the key clutched in my sweaty palm. "I need to access a safety deposit box," I told the clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair. "Of course, dear. Do you have the key and identification?" I showed her my driver's license and the key. She looked up the information on her computer, and her expression shifted to something I couldn't quite read. "Box 247. Yes, this account has been paid in full for the next 5 years. Mr. Mitchell was very thorough in his arrangements." She smiled. "He came in regularly to visit this box, always said he was checking on something important for his granddaughter." We went through the security procedures, signature verification, escort to the vault area, the ritual of using 2 keys to open the small metal door. The clerk left me alone in a private viewing room with the contents of the box. Inside was a manila folder, thick with documents, and a smaller wooden box similar to the one that held his medals. I opened the folder first and found myself looking at financial documents that made my heart race. There were bank statements, investment account summaries, and legal paperwork that I had to read 3 times before I could believe what I was seeing. Grandpa Joe had been saving money for me, not just small amounts, substantial sums that he had been setting aside for years. A savings account in my name with nearly $50,000, a certificate of deposit that had been growing for a decade, stock investments in steady, reliable companies. All told, it was more money than I had ever imagined having access to. But it was the letter attached to the financial documents that brought tears to my eyes. "Sarah, if you're reading this, then you've probably already processed the shock of seeing these numbers. I know it's a lot to take in. Let me explain. After Grandma Rose died, I realized that I was living alone in a house that was paid for, with a pension and Social Security that covered more than my simple needs. I started asking myself what I wanted to do with the money I wouldn't be spending. I watched your parents struggling to help you with college costs while also managing your brother's expenses and their own financial pressures. I saw how you worked multiple jobs just to pay for textbooks and food. I watched you wear the same 3 outfits to every family gathering because you couldn't afford new clothes but were too proud to ask for help. So I started setting money aside, not to spoil you, but to give you options, to make sure that financial pressure wouldn't force you to make decisions based on desperation instead of based on what you really wanted to do with your life. This money comes with only one condition. Use it in a way that honors the values we've talked about during our Sunday visits. Use it to serve others, to make the world a little bit better, to stand up for people who need someone in their corner. I trust your judgment completely. Whether that means finishing school without working 3 jobs, starting a non-profit organization, traveling to gain experience in different communities, or simply having a safety net that lets you take risks in service of helping others, that's your decision. You've already proven to me that you understand what matters in life. Now I want you to have the resources to pursue it without constant worry about rent and groceries. One more thing. There's something else in the box that belonged to your great-grandfather, my father. He died when I was young, but he left me something that shaped how I understood my place in the world. I'm passing it down to you now. I love you, sweetheart. Make me proud. Grandpa Joe. I set the letter down and opened the smaller wooden box with trembling hands. Inside was a pocket watch, old and beautifully maintained, with an inscription on the back, to Thomas Mitchell for 20 years of faithful service, Pittsburgh Steelworks, 1952. My great-grandfather's watch. I had never known much about him, just that he had worked in the steel mills and died young from lung problems related to his job. But here was tangible proof of his dedication to providing for his family, of showing up day after day for work that was dangerous and difficult. Wrapped around the watch was another note, this one shorter. This watch belonged to my father, Thomas Mitchell. He worked in conditions that would horrify modern safety inspectors, breathing air that slowly killed him, because he believed that providing for his family was the most important job he could do. He never got recognition for his sacrifice. No medals, no ceremonies, no public acknowledgement. Just a watch from a company that replaced him within a week of his death. But his work mattered. The steel he helped produce built bridges and buildings and ships. His sacrifice allowed my generation to have opportunities he never had. I've carried this watch for 60 years as a reminder that the most important work is often the work that goes unnoticed. That serving others, whether in a steel mill, a rice paddy in Vietnam, or a coffee shop while putting yourself through school, is noble work regardless of how the world values it. Now it's yours. Let it remind you that you come from a line of people who understood that life isn't about being seen or celebrated. It's about showing up, doing the work, and leaving the world a little bit better than you found it. I held the watch in my palm, feeling its solid weight and thinking about the chain of hands that had held it before mine. My great-grandfather, working in dangerous conditions to feed his family. Grandpa Joe, carrying it through war and construction work and 40 years of quiet service to his community. And now me, a barista and social work student who had often felt like her contributions didn't matter. But they did matter. I could see that now. Every smile I offered to a tired customer, every time I listened to a co-worker's problems, every hour I spent at the Veterans Center, it was all part of the same tradition of service that had defined my family for generations. The financial security Grandpa Joe had provided wasn't just about money. It was about freedom. The freedom to choose service over survival, to make decisions based on what was right rather than what was financially necessary. I spent another hour in that small room, going through the documents and trying to process the magnitude of what had just changed in my life. There were instructions for accessing the accounts, contact information for a financial advisor Grandpa Joe had worked with, suggestions for how I might want to invest or use the money. But most importantly, there was trust. Complete, unwavering trust in my judgment and my character. He had given me resources without restrictions because he believed I would use them wisely. When I finally left the bank, I felt like I was walking taller. The weight of financial stress that I had carried for so long was simply gone, replaced by something much more powerful: purpose. I called in sick to work that day too, but this time it wasn't because I was overwhelmed. It was because I needed to think, to plan, to figure out how to honor the incredible gift I had been given. I drove to Discovery Park, where Grandpa Joe and I used to walk on sunny Sunday afternoons and sat on our favorite bench overlooking Puget Sound. The water was gray-green under the overcast sky, with ferries making their steady progress between the islands. Mount Rainier was hidden behind clouds, but I could sense its presence the way you always can in Seattle. This was the view Grandpa Joe had loved, the place where he had shared some of his most important stories with me. I pulled out my phone and called the coffee shop. "Marcus, it's Sarah. I need to give you my 2 weeks' notice." My manager was surprised, but understanding. I had been a reliable employee, never causing problems, always showing up on time. He wished me well and asked if I was moving on to something better. "I think so," I said. "I'm going back to school full-time to finish my degree, and then I'm going to start something of my own." The idea had been forming in my mind as I sat there watching the ferries. A nonprofit organization focused on helping veterans transition to civilian life, combining my social work training with the deep understanding of military culture I had gained through Grandpa Joe's stories and my volunteer work at the Veterans Center. There was a gap in services for older veterans, men and women like Grandpa Joe, who had served decades ago but still struggled with issues related to their military experience, PTSD that had never been properly diagnosed or treated, social isolation that came from civilian society's inability to understand what they had experienced, financial problems that stemmed from discrimination against veterans in hiring and housing. I could use Grandpa Joe's legacy to address those problems. The money would let me start small, but think big. I could rent office space, hire qualified counselors, create programs that treated veterans with the dignity and respect they deserved. But first, I needed to finish my degree. The financial security meant I could take a full course load, focus on my studies without the distraction of worrying about rent money. I could do internships at organizations that interested me rather than whatever paid the most. I could choose my path based on passion rather than necessity. That evening, I called Colonel Hayes. "Colonel, it's Sarah Mitchell. I wanted to thank you for encouraging me to visit the bank. I take it you found what Joe wanted you to find? More than I ever could have imagined. But I also have a question for you. I'm thinking about starting a nonprofit to help veterans, and I could use advice from someone with experience in military culture." There was a pause, and then I heard what sounded like pride in his voice. "Sarah, I would be honored to help you with something like that. When do you want to start?" Over the next several weeks, I threw myself into planning. I researched existing veteran services, identified gaps that needed to be filled, and began developing a business plan for what I decided to call the Joseph Mitchell Veterans Support Center. I enrolled in a full course load at the University of Washington for the spring semester. Without the pressure of working to pay tuition, I could take classes that genuinely interested me rather than just fulfilling degree requirements. I signed up for courses in nonprofit management, trauma counseling, and military sociology. But perhaps most importantly, I started telling people about my plans. I had spent so many years being the quiet one, the observer, the family member who faded into the background. Now I found myself speaking up in ways I never had before. At the next family gathering, my cousin Derek's birthday party, I didn't sit quietly in the corner. When Uncle Mark asked what I was up to these days, I told him about my plans for the Veterans Center. When Jessica made a dismissive comment about all those homeless veterans downtown, I calmly but firmly educated her about the challenges that veterans face when transitioning to civilian life. My parents seemed stunned by this new version of their daughter. I could see them looking at each other with expressions that clearly said, "When did Sarah become so assertive?" But it wasn't assertiveness exactly. It was confidence born from finally understanding my own worth. Grandpa Joe's belief in me had unlocked something that had been there all along. I just hadn't known how to access it. The most surprising reaction came from Aunt Linda. After dinner, she pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. We never really saw you, did we? We were so focused on the kids who made noise, who demanded attention, that we overlooked the one who was quietly becoming extraordinary." I started to protest, but she held up her hand. "No, let me finish. Dad saw it, though. He talked about you constantly. Always said you were going to surprise everyone someday. I guess I just thought he was being a doting grandfather, but he was right, wasn't he? You're going to do something really important with your life." It was the first time any member of my extended family had expressed genuine pride in who I was, rather than disappointment in who I wasn't. The validation felt good, but it wasn't something I needed anymore. Grandpa Joe's legacy had taught me to value my own opinion of myself above anyone else's. That night, I sat in my apartment with his metal box open on the table beside me, writing in a journal I had started keeping. I wanted to record this transition period, this time when I was becoming the person he had always believed I could be. October 15th. Today I realized that grief isn't just about missing someone who's gone. It's also about discovering parts of yourself that you never knew existed. Grandpa Joe's death forced me to see myself through his eyes, and what I found there was completely different from what I had always believed about myself. For years, I thought being overlooked meant I was forgettable. But maybe it just meant I was observing, learning, preparing for something bigger. Maybe all those years of feeling invisible were actually teaching me to see other invisible people. The veterans who get ignored on street corners, the elderly who get dismissed as irrelevant, the quiet ones like I used to be who have so much to offer if someone would just notice. I'm not invisible anymore, not because anyone else has finally seen me, but because I've finally seen myself. I closed the journal and picked up my great-grandfather's pocket watch. It was nearly midnight, and the watch was still keeping perfect time after all these decades. There was something profound about holding an object that had witnessed so much history, so many changes, so many generations of people who had faced their challenges with quiet dignity. Tomorrow I would start my new classes. Next week, I had a meeting with a lawyer about nonprofit incorporation. In a month, I had an interview with the director of the VA hospital about potential partnerships. But tonight, I just sat with the watch and the medals and the knowledge that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Grandpa Joe had given me more than money or family heirlooms. He had given me permission to believe in myself, and for the first time in my life, I finally did. 6 months later, I was standing in the lobby of a modest office building in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, watching contractors install a sign that read, Joseph Mitchell Veterans Support Center. The space wasn't large, just 3 rooms and a small reception area, but it was ours, and it represented something I had never thought possible. A dream made real through careful planning and unwavering purpose. Colonel Hayes stood beside me, wearing civilian clothes but still maintaining that unmistakable military bearing. At 74, he had become my closest advisor and the center's first board member. His network of veteran contacts had been invaluable in getting the organization off the ground. Joe would be proud, Sarah. This is exactly what he meant when he talked about service. I nodded, still amazed by how much had changed since that October day at the cemetery. The grief was still there. I don't think you ever stopped missing someone who meant as much to me as Grandpa Joe had, but it had transformed into something productive, something that honored his memory while helping others. The center officially opened the following Monday. Our first client was a Vietnam veteran named Robert Santos, a 68-year-old man who had been struggling with PTSD symptoms for decades without ever receiving proper treatment. He had heard about our services through the VA hospital and was skeptical but desperate enough to try. I've been to counselors before, he told me during our initial intake session. They all want to talk about feelings and coping strategies, but they don't understand what it was like over there. They don't know what it's like to come home to people who think you're either a hero or a monster, with nothing in between. I listened to his story, taking careful notes, but mostly just being present in the way Grandpa Joe had taught me. Robert had served 2 tours in Vietnam, had seen friends die, had done things he couldn't talk about with civilians. He had come home to protests and indifference, had struggled with jobs and relationships, had numbed himself with alcohol for years before getting sober through AA. I'm not looking for sympathy, he said firmly. I just want someone to understand that the war didn't end for us when we came home. It just got quieter. My grandfather served in Vietnam too, I told him. He used to say that the hardest part wasn't what happened over there, but feeling like no one here understood what you had been through. Robert's expression shifted. Your grandfather? I told him about Grandpa Joe, about his service record and his quiet strength, about how he had rarely talked about the war, but had carried its lessons with him every day. As I spoke, I could see Robert relaxing, his defensive posture softening. What was his name? Robert asked. Joseph Mitchell, Staff Sergeant, 1st Infantry Division. Robert's eyes widened. Big red one? I was with the 25th Infantry, but we worked with the 1st ID on several operations. What years was he there? 1968 to 1970. Son of a bitch. I might have crossed paths with him. We were all in the same mud, dealing with the same shit. Robert paused, studying my face. You really understand this stuff, don't you? You're not just reading from a textbook. I'm still learning, I said honestly. But I've been listening to veterans' stories my whole life, and I know that what you experienced over there was real. And what you've been dealing with since coming home is real too. Over the following weeks, Robert became one of our most regular clients. But more than that, he became an advocate for the center's approach. He brought friends, men who had been suspicious of traditional mental health services, but were willing to trust an organization that understood their culture. We started a weekly group session that met on Thursday evenings. The participants ranged in age from their late 50s to their 80s, representing different conflicts and different branches of service. But they shared common experiences: the difficulty of transitioning to civilian life, the challenge of processing traumatic memories, the frustration of dealing with bureaucratic systems that didn't understand their needs. I facilitated these sessions, drawing on my social work training, but also on the wisdom Grandpa Joe had shared during our Sunday afternoon conversations. I learned to listen for what wasn't being said, to recognize when someone was struggling even if they didn't want to admit it, to create space for difficult emotions without trying to fix everything immediately. One evening, Robert brought a newspaper clipping to group. It was an article about the center from the Seattle Times, featuring a photograph of me standing in front of Grandpa Joe's portrait that hung in our main office. "Listen to this," Robert said, reading aloud. Sarah Mitchell, 24, founded the Joseph Mitchell Veteran Support Center using an inheritance from her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran who believed in the importance of serving others. The center provides counseling, advocacy, and community support specifically tailored to the needs of older veterans. He set the paper down and looked around the circle. "You know what I like about this article? It doesn't call us heroes or victims. It just says we're veterans who deserve support. That's all we ever wanted, to be treated like human beings who served our country and then came home to build lives like everyone else." The group murmured agreement, and I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. Not anxiety this time, but gratitude. These men had trusted me with their stories, had allowed me to create a space where they could be authentic about their experiences. It was exactly the kind of work Grandpa Joe had envisioned when he wrote about service and dignity. But the center's impact extended beyond our weekly sessions. We had partnered with local housing organizations to help homeless veterans find stable accommodation. We worked with employers who were genuinely committed to hiring veterans, not just those looking for tax breaks or good publicity. We provided advocacy services for veterans navigating the VA system, helping them access benefits they had earned but didn't know how to claim. And we had started something I was particularly proud of, a mentorship program that paired older veterans with younger ones returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. The generational divide between these groups had been a real challenge in traditional support programs, but our approach helped them find common ground in shared values and experiences. Colonel Hayes had been instrumental in developing this program. Despite his age, he had thrown himself into the work with an enthusiasm that reminded me of Grandpa Joe's dedication to whatever he believed in. "The beautiful thing about military service," the colonel told me one day as we reviewed applications from potential mentors, "is that the core values transcend the specific conflicts. Honor, courage, commitment, those mean the same thing whether you served in Vietnam or Afghanistan." 3 months after opening, we received our first major donation from outside the family trust fund. A local businessman whose father had been a World War II veteran contributed $50,000 after visiting the center and seeing our work firsthand. The donation came with a note. "This is exactly the kind of program my dad would have appreciated. Thank you for treating veterans with the respect they deserve." With the additional funding, we were able to hire our first full-time counselor, a licensed clinical social worker who specialized in trauma therapy and had experience working with military populations. Maria Rodriguez had served in the Navy herself before pursuing her graduate degree, and she brought both professional expertise and personal understanding to the role. "Sarah, what you've created here is special," Maria told me during her first week on the job. "I've worked at other veteran service organizations, and they're often either too clinical or too informal. This place strikes the right balance between professional support and genuine community." Having Maria on staff allowed me to focus more on the administrative and development side of the organization. I spent time building relationships with other nonprofits, attending community meetings, and writing grant proposals to ensure the center's long-term sustainability. But I still made time for direct client work. That connection to the people we served was essential. It kept me grounded in the real impact of what we were doing, rather than getting lost in paperwork and policy discussions. One afternoon, I was working at my desk when I heard familiar voices in the reception area. I looked up to see my parents talking with Maria, looking around the space with expressions of amazement. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" My mother turned, and I could see she had been crying. "Honey, we wanted to see what you had built. We've been hearing about it from everyone. Linda, the neighbors, even people at Dad's work who saw that newspaper article." My father stepped forward, looking uncharacteristically emotional. "Sarah, we owe you an apology. We never saw what Dad saw in you. We were so focused on conventional success, good grades, traditional careers, the kind of achievements that are easy to brag about at parties, that we missed the real substance of who you are." I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, but this time it was mixed with something else. Forgiveness. You don't need to apologize. You did the best you could with what you understood at the time. "But we should have understood better," my mother said. "We should have seen that you were building something meaningful, even when it wasn't obvious or flashy." My father was studying Grandpa Joe's portrait on the wall. "He knew, didn't he? He saw what you would become before any of us did." "He saw who I already was," I corrected gently. "He just helped me see it too." We spent an hour walking through the center, and I explained our programs and philosophy. My parents asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely impressed by what we had accomplished in such a short time. But more than that, they seemed to finally understand who their daughter had become. As they were leaving, my mother hugged me tightly. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. Really proud. Not just of this place, but of the woman you are." After they left, I sat in my office looking at Grandpa Joe's portrait and feeling his presence in a way I hadn't since those first weeks after his funeral. The grief was still there, but it had evolved into something that felt more like gratitude than loss. That evening, I drove to the cemetery for the first time since the funeral. Grandpa Joe's headstone was simple granite with his name, dates, and military service information. The flowers I had left months earlier were long gone, replaced by small American flags that someone, probably Colonel Hayes, had placed there. I knelt beside the grave, no longer worried about getting my clothes dirty or looking foolish. "I did it, Grandpa," I whispered. "I built something that matters, and I finally understand what you meant about service. It's not about getting recognition or applause. It's about showing up consistently for people who need someone in their corner." The October wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree overhead, and I imagined it was his way of responding. I pulled the pocket watch from my bag and checked the time. It was nearly sunset, the time of day when Grandpa Joe used to lower his flag and reflect on the day's accomplishments. "The center is just the beginning," I continued. "I want to expand to other cities, train other people to do this work, create a network of support that reaches veterans who are still falling through the cracks. I want to build something that will outlast me, the way your values have outlasted you." As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in months. The center was thriving, my relationships with family had healed, and I had finally found my place in the world. But most importantly, I had learned to see myself through Grandpa Joe's eyes, not as someone who had been overlooked, but as someone who had been carefully prepared for something important. The Joseph Mitchell Veteran Support Center wasn't just a memorial to my grandfather. It was proof that his belief in me had been justified, that his investment in my future had paid dividends in ways he probably never could have imagined. And every day, as I helped veterans find their own paths forward, I was reminded that the best way to honor someone's legacy isn't to preserve it unchanged, but to let it grow and evolve into something that serves the world they believed in. Grandpa Joe had given me his medals, his money, and his unwavering faith in who I could become. In return, I had given him something that would last far longer than any monument or memorial, a living legacy of service that would continue helping people long after both of us were gone. As I drove home through the Seattle evening traffic, I could almost hear his voice one more time. "That's my granddaughter. That's the woman I always knew she would become." And for the first time in my life, I completely agreed with him.